What is the most horrifying thing you've ever witnessed? Watched my own sister die in a hospital bed after my family made the decision to end her life support. Just thinking about it makes my eyes well up with tears. Let me tell you, after seeing that I never joked about death. That was by far the hardest thing I've ever had to see. When you see someone dying in a hospital bed on TV or in the movies, they slowly close their eyes and fade away. When you see someone dying in a hospital bed in real life, let me tell you, it isn't like the movies, at all. The person is choking, struggling to breathe, eyes twitching, body twitching. It's just horrible to see. I consider myself a pretty emotionally solid guy, but I just lost it when I saw my sister dying in that bed and I had to leave after about 30 minutes of seeing her trying to cling onto life. My parents, on the other hand, stayed the entire time, over 10 hours, and to this day it breaks my heart seeing them because I know that so many things remind them of their daughter, and they'll never see her again. The part that always makes me cry is remembering my dad's desperation in the hospital. Offering to give his organs if it could save his daughter's life, saying it doesn't matter if he loses his life. Offering to give the doctors millions and millions of dollars. Dad used to be a CEO of a government health sector, very wealthy, if they could just save his daughter's life. By far the most selfless thing I've ever seen him do and the most powerful message he could have sent my brother and I, that he cares for his children more than anything in the world. Sorry about all that seriousness, I just noticed most of the comments are pretty funny. Struggling with extreme depression before and after the death of my sister, this quote from Kubrick has literally saved my life, as I have stopped considering suicide after reading that powerful message. I woke up to find my fiancé had passed away suddenly during the night. He was cold and stiff, eyes open. Horrible, just absolutely horrible. My fiancé woke me up by making a loud noise, which was actually not too unexpected as she was a sleep talker / walker and had done so many times in the past. I rolled over and put my arm on her chest, and I realized she wasn't breathing. I checked for her pulse but couldn't find one. I called 911 and started doing CPR, while counting chest compressions to the lady on the phone. This is after she had me move her to the floor. The last time I got to see her face was when I was doing that. After the EMTs had arrived and taken her to the hospital, we weren't allowed to see her. After she passed away, they took her to the medical examiner for a full autopsy as they didn't know why she died, and part of the process was to not let anyone see the body until they were done. Due to the autopsy, her parents decided it was best to cremate her. I really feel for you in this. Right about now you're wondering why you started reading this stuff, right? His dog was really sick and couldn't walk, and it was obvious that he wasn't going to live much longer. So for a few days he was lying around because he couldn't move. My cousin, who was out of town, comes back because it was his birthday. So, he gets home and the dog actually gets up and runs around and plays with him all day. He died the next, though that was amazing. And sad. I sat in the living room with my mom and dad talking to my mom about why I can't stand her as a person. She asked me how I really felt, so I told her. Being a young teen, I didn't let back and didn't think about how much it would hurt her. You know what that's like, I'm sure. Mom went to her room after crying heavily during the entire conversation. Dad and I left the house to breathe and get food. We pulled in the driveway and Dad asked me to feed the dog, but being a kid dodging chores, I told him I would take the food, and instead I walked in the door calling for my mom to get the food. She didn't answer, so I walked in her room. She was laying face down on the bed, completely unconscious, her bed covered in pills from the assortment of bottles in her drug bag. There was a yellow legal pad sheet with red ink shooting from the paper every single word of her suicide note. I yelled for Dad I don't know how many times, and he came upstairs and called 911. I sat on the porch reading her suicide note over and over until EMS arrived and took the note from me. As Forrest Gumpish as this sounds, I just started running and didn't stop till I reached the next county. I will never forget her face, her skin pushing on her to try and wake her up. I ask myself every day, why didn't I just feed the dog, or why did I tell her the shit that I did? I watched my father die in front of me in our backyard. We were cleaning up and doing some general landscape type of stuff when he went in for some sodas. He came out and dropped a soda and then picked it up and sat down to drink it. I turned to him and he had soda dripping from his mouth. The right side of his face had drooped and I said, "You're having a stroke." He tried to say, "No, I'm fine," but it was sort of garbled. He fell to the ground and I held him up until the ambulance came. I could hear the sirens getting louder and louder as they got closer to the house. When we got to the hospital, they told us he'd had a catastrophic stroke and blood leaked to his brain. The rest of his body was still working, so they had to put him on a morphine drip, and he officially passed later that night in hospice. I still play it out in my head. He'll have been dead 6 years on June 5th at 10:10 p.m. I miss him so much, and even more now that my wife and I are trying to have a baby. I saw a guy fall over on his bike a few cars ahead of me in traffic. He had fallen with his head under the tire of another vehicle. His brain popped out and was several inches away from his head, mostly intact. I was on my motorcycle heading to my friend's house on a big 6-lane road at night. I pulled in to get gas, and just as I was leaving the gas station I saw what looked like my friend's motorcycle. I didn't know he was just heading home from the gym on the same road I was. It was just a coincidence. Seconds later I see an accident scene ahead. The moment I saw the bike, I knew who it was. It was my best friend, lying in the road, lit by headlights, pieces of his bike everywhere. The way he was twisted, I have never seen a person. His right arm was bent the wrong direction. His left arm was shattered. His left leg was a million pieces, basically just encased in skin. He still had a helmet on, and blood was flowing out of it. I was watching my best friend die in the street in front of me. Thankfully an ER nurse was one of the first cars stopped. I'm a photojournalist, so I started taking pictures, documenting it, while shaking and trembling in tears. The accident had been a dreaded left turner where a car just turns across right in front of you. He was going maybe 50 miles per hour at the time, 10 feet before the impact. There was just one dark line of locked tire, then blam. His body hit the side of the truck at high speed as the left side of his body shattered and bones turned into splinters. I started calling people immediately, everybody who was within a 30-minute radius of the accident. I remember calling my brother and telling him, if there's anything you need to say to Andy, you need to get here now. It seemed like it took forever. He was lying in the street for half an hour as paramedics worked on him to stabilize him. As I stood over him, his eyes opened. He recognized me, kept whispering my name, but he was completely out of it. I told him I'd take care of things. Then I had to call his mother, who was 3 hours away. If he was going to die, I knew she wouldn't be able to make it in time. So I told her he's in bad shape, but they're doing a good job on him, and she needs to get up here now. Then the helicopter came. He was airlifted to the hospital as close to death as I've ever seen a person outside of a funeral. He was in surgery for more than 10 hours the first day. He endured at least a dozen surgeries after that. He was in ICU for 20 days. He was in the hospital for more than a month. He lost 30 pounds just in the hospital on foreign fluids. He was on a hospital bed in his own house for 2 months. He walked after 2, with a titanium rod in his left leg surrounded by a slowly regenerating bone. The accident stopped his studying for a law degree for a year. But he went back to law school after he was well enough. He graduated the top of his class, summa cum laude, from the University of Florida. His father, who flew from Argentina to help his recovery, died the final year he was in law school. My friend is now a top lawyer, working for a federal district court, less than a year out of law school. To this day he hasn't regained the use of his left arm and hand. Hopefully one day he will. He used those photos I took to sue the driver who turned in front of him. The driver was Chinese. He fled the country and didn't come back. I remember being on the side of the road that night, not knowing who had hit him, and I saw a witness who I later learned was the driver, telling the cop that my friend was going so fast he didn't see him. My friend was doing the speed limit. He was trying to sell out my dying friend while he laid in the street. So yeah, it's my dream that one day my best friend will get justice from that guy who nearly killed him and then left the country like a coward. But until then, my friend is just fine being one of the best lawyers in the country. Went hunting with stepdad. He had a doe license or something? So he could hunt a doe. All weekend we couldn't find game. But on the way home next to the road we found a doe grazing. He pulls out his rifle and shoots it. We get super excited and run out to see. Next to the body there were 2 baby fawns. They didn't even realize the mother was dead. We don't know what to do, so my dad tells me to chase the fawns away. I start crying while throwing rocks at them. They get scared but ultimately don't back away more than 10 feet of their mother. We drag the body over to an area where we could gut it. They follow. I watch them as he skins them. I couldn't even describe how I felt or the look in their eyes. We leave the skin and keep the body. As we drive away, I look back and I see one of them licking the skin of their mother. I never went hunting again. And didn't speak to my father for several weeks. Edit. So a couple people are thinking I'm trolling and lying, etc. So here are some clear-ups. 1. I was 8 years old, so I apologize if the story doesn't tie up perfectly, for those who actually do hunt. 2. I know it's illegal to shoot a gun from a car, and I honestly have no clue if what we did was legal. We could have been poaching, but I wouldn't have known. 3. I don't know what time of year it was super cloudy, which is more than common for Washington. 4. I'm not even sure if it was Washington, either there or Oregon. My father committed suicide a while back, using a shotgun slug to the head. He did it in the garage. My brother and I cleaned up the mess as best we could, after the official cleaners were done. We kept noticing a smell though. After a week or so, we really got down and pulled everything out of the garage. Wedged behind the dryer was a large section of brain. Hard to forget that moment. Watching a co-worker have a heart attack and fall onto the table saw and have his chest ripped open. He was dead even if he didn't fall on the table saw. Massive heart attack. Next to seeing someone fall into an acid bath, he only burned his leg. The smell of it was more horrifying. Note: I worked for my dad during my teenage years in an industrial complex. Old folks' home. All the old sit in their wheelchairs in the hallways and stare you down as you walk by. All very sad and decrepit. One even said, "Take me home with you." Terrifying. I work in a kitchen of one of those places. Fortunately I don't have to leave the kitchen much, but when I do, shit gets terrifying. I once was walking by this extremely old woman, probably around 103 years old, and she grabbed my arm out of nowhere, started calling me her mommy, and asking me to take her away because it was dark and cold where she was. I avoided walking within 2 feet of her from that day forward. I've never admitted this string of events to anyone IRL for the fear that they won't want to be my friend, so here goes. 1st grade, trick-or-treating. Guy jumps out of the bushes to scare us. My friend runs into the street in fear and gets hit by a car. Dead. Guy who scared us was my brother's best friend. Guy driving the car was our neighbor. 3rd grade, playing with 2 friends at friend's house. One friend disappears for a minute then returns with a pistol. Before me or my other friend can say anything, he accidentally discharges it into my other friend's head. Dead. 2 best friends gone instantly. Shooter moves away. 4th grade, go to visit my best friend who was in the hospital. Granted, he had childhood leukemia, so he wasn't likely to live long. But after receiving a bone marrow transplant that appeared to be working, he gets a blood transfusion that kills him. Happens to be the day I go visit him. High school. Ask a girl out on a date just before graduation. She says yes. Really liked her. That night she's riding in a Jeep with a friend and he flips it. Kills her. College. Caravan across the mountain pass back to college. 3 people, 2 friends, some other guy, in the car ahead of us. He takes a corner too fast for the conditions, rolls the car, 2 of 3 dead. The guy I didn't know survived. Later in life. Reconnect with buddy from high school after our reunion. We share stories about family, life, etc. 2 weeks later he died working on his car. Reconnect on FB with a girl I dated in high school. She sends me this weird message, kind of manic, trying to get me to buy into some multi-level marketing thing or whatever. Then proceeds to tell me how much she loved me, yada, yada. I, happily married now, say, yes, we had fun, and I have great memories of you. Find out 2 weeks later she hanged herself. Wanna be my friend? I grew up in an extremely ghetto part of West Virginia when I was a kid. It was basically boys and a hood IRL. Just to give you the setting. One day, I was out in the neighborhood playing baseball with my friends when we saw an older kid named Lorenzo running by frantically. Lorenzo was a bit of a star in the neighborhood for being such a great ball player, so we all kind of looked up to him. At the time, it was becoming well known that he was getting caught up in selling crack, like most of the other kids his age that lived around me. After he ran by us, we chased him down the street because he looked like he was in trouble. After a while of us chasing after him and yelling for him to stop, he stopped right in front of our elementary school and turned to face us. He tried to catch his breath and then all he said was, "They're going to kill me. I can't stop him. They're going to kill me." He reached into his pants and pulled out a small pistol. All in unison, my whole group of friends screamed no. But he put it to his temple and blew his brains out of the other side of his head, all over the main entrance wall of the school. His body stood in place for a moment while we all stared in shock. After what seemed like a slow-motion lifetime, his body tipped over like a tree and laid lifeless on the sidewalk. Hopefully the most disturbing thing I will ever have to witness. When I was 7, my mother was raped by 2 junkies she was friends with. In front of me, we were homeless due to her complete mental breakdown. She had gotten pregnant with a man she was in love with, but for reasons still unclear to me, he left. She decided to give her son up for adoption, and then suffered a mental breakdown. She lost her job, our apartment, and refused to work towards getting her life back. She succumbed to severe alcohol abuse and nearly caused us to be removed from the homeless shelter we stayed at. Sometimes, in these drunken states, she refused to go to the shelter for the night, forcing me to stay up with her and whatever guy she was clinging to. These binges would last days at times. Mostly this man sleeping in cars for a couple hours at a time. On that particular night, some friends she knew from years before wanted to party, and that meant heroin for them. Mom did not take part, I don't think. She did however get stupid drunk. She was blacked out, not passed out, for hours. They drove us to a park and her 2 friends sprawled her on the grass under a tree and both had a go at her, all the while her screaming for them to stop. I was in the car asleep, but obviously watching. Later they were back in the car grinning about how tight she was. She swears she remembers none of this. Which is understandable given how disgustingly drunk she was. First grade was pretty rough. I was DJing at a nightclub, and between sets I was walking out to a 7-Eleven to get some cigarettes. While I was waiting for the walk signal at the corner, a bicyclist tried to cross against the light. A large SUV hit the cyclist and skidded through the intersection, decapitating the cyclist in the process. The scene was the most horrific I think I have ever personally witnessed. I had to work in a cadaver lab several times during an internship where I was working with a product development team for medical devices and implants. I was with a bunch of people from my lab group and we were testing out this implant on a severed human leg. Once the tests were done and it was time to go, my boss turns to me and tells me to put the leg in this giant biohazard bag, wrap it up and throw it in the freezer. I proceed to wrap this leg up. Manhandling old dude's hairy half-ass is not fun, believe me, and then carry it to the freezer. Once I slid open the door to the freezer, I saw what was literally the most horrifying sight I have ever seen. It was this huge freezer room with dozens and dozens of body parts everywhere. Hanging off the walls, stacked in piles, arms, legs, torsos, hands. Everything. It literally looked like a serial killer's storage compartment from a movie or something. The smell was so horrid, I would have passed out if I hadn't spent the last 4 hours working on a cadaver leg anyway. A significant number of these parts were in bags, thankfully, but the concept of so many dead bodies concentrated in front of me in that moment was the most horrifying thing ever in my mind. I literally threw in the bag I had in my hand as quickly as I could and slammed the door shut. Seeing my dad completely fall apart after my mom died. Shortly before this last Christmas, my mom died from a heart attack. She was 63. When I got home just after I heard the news, I saw my sisters sitting there, and we all held each other and cried. My dad, trying to stay strong, stood in the background and offered us some kind words, saying how proud Mom was of all 3 of us. He's always been a very strong man, and never shows much emotion. A few days go by, and my dad sits me down to get my thoughts on the obituary he wrote for Mom. He read calmly, just as if he were reading the morning news. A couple of sentences into it, he completely fell apart. He cried uncontrollably, hunched over, and started hitting his knee with his fist. His whole body was shaking. Seeing my dad in that much pain was unbearable. I'm a paraplegic with stage 4 decubitus ulcers, like bed sores. One of these got badly infected, making me very sick, sepsis, so with a fever of 105.5 I got into the car and drove myself to the hospital. Long story short, they didn't believe I was sick. The doc thought I was just showing up to get pain meds because I was young and paralyzed, and sent me home without even an exam. I was so cold when I got home that I got in the shower and blasted the warm water. My shower chair was shaped kind of like a toilet seat so to make it easier to wash one's private parts. As I was sitting there I noticed that I was bleeding into the tub. I reached down to see if the skin was still intact, and a large lump of flesh, about the size of a small fist, fell off of me into the tub. I reached around my butt where the sores were to feel around and assess the damage, scared out of my wits now, and felt something hard but rather loose. I barely touched it and it fell off and landed on top the lump of flesh. Turns out, it was my coccyx. Needless to say, I went back to the hospital with my old parts in a bag, and they admitted me for a more than 6-month stay. Prison. One inmate refused to pay another after losing a bet. The other guy put petroleum jelly and some other gels and liquids in a cup in the microwave for 5 minutes and then threw it on his face as he was watching TV in the pod's rec room. I've never heard a more horrifying scream, and never saw someone thrash around so much. Happened when I was a kid. Brushing my teeth outside the house, right by our fence. Saw the neighbor's 5-year-old malnourished kid squat down right in their yard not a few yards away from where I was standing and shit long strands of spaghetti. I was horrified, but couldn't move. Kinda like being transfixed looking at an accident and not being able to look away. After the kid waddled away and left me standing there in wide-eyed horror, my eyes were drawn to the pile of spaghetti he left on their yard. The strands were moving. Worms. I ran back crying inside the house. Edit lol. Clarifications are in order I guess. First off, I grew up in a rural farm community in one of the southern provinces in the Philippines. While most of the families within the community did okay relative to the economic situation, the neighboring family where I was raised was so dirt poor that their house was pretty much a shack. The kids ran around barefoot in the dirt yard every day since the parents were off tilling the farms or working odd jobs. Second, I was brushing my teeth outside since we just finished eating lunch inside. My aunties were busy washing dishes in the sink and my uncle was groaning in the bathroom. Third, yes, I did run in and tell the older folks about it and they did talk to the kids' parents when they got back. Unfortunately, that's as far as it went. There are no child services in the third world, that I know of, at least, and poor families like that barely have enough money to put food on their table, and basic hygiene pretty much takes a backseat during poverty. Reloading armament during Commando Wrath. I look over to a medevac 60 taking casualties being traded off by the insertion birds. An Afghan National Army soldier with a severe head wound got off the medevac helicopter to give up his spot to make room for a man writhing on a stretcher. The man on the stretcher was being held down by a wool blanket. He was struggling fiercely against those attempting to get him aid. Finally he is able to pull the blanket off himself to reveal that he is missing a great portion of his torso. The scream that emanated after seemed audible over the chop of many rotor blades and turbine engines. There were others, but this one sticks out for some reason. Saw my best friend of 13 years get hit by a drunk driver going 58 miles per hour. He flew through the air and the resulting sound was absolutely terrible. What was worse is that he didn't die on impact, so I sat there and watched him as he cried and eventually left me, and then had to go tell his mother what had happened. Needless to say, there were quite a few horrifying sights that day. Was getting a fountain drink at a convenience store and on the way out heard a thud along with screeching tires. Looked in the middle of the road and saw some object that looked like a cardboard box. Looked to my right and saw that an SUV had its hazard lights on and was slowly pulling into the store's parking lot. I slowly realized that the cardboard box was a person and I ran out to see if the person was alive or dead. I was the first one to reach the guy and, like an idiot, I asked him, "Hey, man, are you okay?" He was convulsing, blood coming from his mouth. Both shoes had been thrown from his body, and his arm was twisted in a way that I knew it was dislocated. I'm positive he was in shock. Thank God someone showed up and relieved me of my duty and started waving at traffic so no one hit him because I was far too jolted to do anything other than ask that asinine question. My dad strapped to a hospital bed going through detox. He kept screaming that the nurses were trying to eat him and pleading with me, asking why I wouldn't help him. A guy was so psychotic, crying and emotional pain just began clawing at his cheeks and face, deep causing bleeding and injury. He didn't care and we had to stop him. But it gave me pause and was very disturbing image. I don't have any horrifying stories. These posts are super bummers. I'm gonna go cry a little bit and eat some tuna fish out of the can with a spoon. Tie for me, watched a guy on a motorcycle get propelled into the side of a car or being in the passenger seat of a car that hit a 12-year-old girl. First, I was sitting in my car in a parking lot near the head of a T-shaped intersection. A guy was driving pretty quickly across the top of the T in one of those crotch rocket motorcycles. A Honda, I believe. A girl in a Hyundai didn't see him and made a left turn just as he was about to cross the intersection. He got launched headfirst into the side of the car. I was about 150 away and could tell from where I was sitting that he was in really hard shape. His bike was wrecked and he was in a really unnatural position and twitching. He was quickly swarmed by people trying to help him out, so I drove away rather than watch the aftermath. I learned from my aunt, who is a nurse at the local trauma center, that his spine was severed and he died later that day. A few years before that, I was in the passenger seat with a friend of mine at the wheel. We were on a 4-lane road in the middle lane. We crested a hill to see a guy in the outside lane with his brake lights on. Just as we were approaching him, we saw a girl's leg come out from in front of his car. He has apparently stopped to let her cross and thus blocked our ability to see her. My friend jumped on the brakes and tried to swerve, but there wasn't any room. We hit one girl and she came through the windshield and basically landed in my lap before being propelled off the front of the car when we finally stopped. The second girl got hit in the arm by the mirror of the car and was thrown back. The mirror collapsed. The happy ending was that she got away with a broken leg and arm and no lasting injuries. My friend was driving a lowered sports coupe, and with the nose ducking of a hard braking maneuver, she was picked up on the car instead of under it. The guy who stopped to let her pass was charged and sued. My friend was credited with a very quick reaction that probably saved her life. He wasn't speeding, and situationally, there's very little he could have done to avoid the accident. The most horrific thing was that the car literally picked her up out of her sneakers and left them neatly on the road 20 behind the car. I was in the process of getting my license at the time and I couldn't get back behind the wheel for 3 years. 4 years ago, I was a prison guard in southern Iraq. As much as our efforts were in keeping our detainees from escaping, we kept them from killing each other. Tried to, anyway. One night the escape alarm sounded. Happened every now and then. It was standard procedure if a compound was missing a man. I was in one of the response forces to this particular radical compound, and a riot nearly broke out when we performed our search. Obviously they were hiding something, and it turned out to be what remained of our missing man, a victim of an impromptu Sharia lynching. Both forearms and shins were shattered. His right temple was crushed and eye popped out, still hanging by its optic nerve. He was covered in over 100 stab wounds, most likely from nail-sized shanks. According to the doctors, he died from bleeding out. Possibly over the course of hours. It was in a big compound, but to this day I wonder how the guards didn't notice. I was one of the first on the scene to see a lady who had been knocked off her bike by a truck at a roundabout. Her skull had been thoroughly run over. A couple friends and I were playing a game of basketball. One of my friends was complaining that his stomach was really bothering him. He said it felt like he really needed to shit, so he farted and everything felt better. A few minutes later I set him up with the ball. He laid it up. Before his feet touched the ground, shit was streaming down his legs. He was wearing white basketball shorts and instantly they turned brown. He ran all the way home with shit streaming down his legs and shit all over his shorts. I'll make this short since I can't stand to think about it for extended periods of time. I was driving home from my job in Orlando very late one night and taking a newly built toll road that most people hadn't started using yet. These toll roads had automated toll booths if you drove straight ahead or manned booths if you veered off to the right again. Apparently the driver of an SUV fell asleep at the wheel because she slowly drifted into the point in the divider to the left of the automated lane, the one closest to oncoming traffic, and launched herself off of it, rolling the car as she did. I jumped out as soon as I saw it and went running towards the car, cell phone in hand. I made it about a dozen steps before I noticed a car seat that had been ejected out the window and landed face forward on the street leaning against the railing. Next thing I remember is being a half-mile down the road crying on the phone with the 911 operator. I made it as far as the next exit before having to have someone pick me up. When I was about 5, I was walking down a busy street with my mom on the way to pick up a pizza. A homeless guy we passed asked her to tie a shoe for him, but she shook her head and we kept walking. On the way back from the pizza shop we saw the same man walk into the street right in front of a bus. The bus driver slammed on his brakes but couldn't stop in time. The homeless man was thrown a few feet forward, cracking his skull open on the pavement when he landed. Blood was everywhere. My sister-in-law got a phone call saying her fiancé had passed away. The blood-curdling scream she let out is seared into my memory. poor guy had been sick for a very long time, so it was not unexpected, but he had been improving and we'd hoped he'd pull through. I saw a guy get shot. I was sitting in my room and heard a lot of yelling coming from the parking lot of the 7-Eleven on the corner. I looked out the window just in time to see the yelling guy get shot. The very first time I did acid, a friend tried to hop a train to ride it across town as we usually do, and he slipped, fell under the train, and the wheel cut his leg off. He was unconscious and there was blood everywhere, and his severed leg got thrown about 10 feet from him from the force of the wheel. It was terrifying. I tried acid again and continued to see this scene in my head over and over again until I came down. When I was younger, my family and I were going to Los Angeles for a vacation. We were on the freeway heading westbound, and there was a tiny pickup truck fully loaded with dressers, mattresses, cabinets, etc. Typical house crap. Well, it was very windy that day, like 40 miles per hour plus wind gusts. The wind was really beating the shit out of this little pickup as the driver was having a real hard time keeping the vehicle from swaying into other lanes. Due to the wind and the vehicle just being overloaded, the driver started losing control and overcorrected, and just like that the truck started to roll over. It must have rolled about 6 times before finally landing upside down. The cab completely crushed. There was no roof at all. The roof of the cab and the truck bed were now the same level. I tried to make the most of our vacation, but it was a little hard knowing that an entire family was just probably killed. Watching my mother die. She went into the hospital on Wednesday morning and the doctor told us she was going to die. So the family set up camp in the room, and for 3 days I watched her deteriorate. From being unable to stand, to being unable to talk, to being unconscious, to breathing erratically, to literally gasping for every breath. It was agonizing for her and for me. For 3 days I begged God to take her. For 3 days all I wanted to do was run out of that room, but I couldn't leave her. And then when she finally died, instead of the relief I had been expecting, suddenly I couldn't breathe. I dry cried because the tears had long since been used up and made donkey sounds as I tried to swallow some air. Later when I got home, I realized that in those 3 days I had somehow lost 20 pounds. I had grieved it away, but the truly horrifying part was during the brief window after Mom could no longer speak but before she lost consciousness. I saw her wide, scared eyes searching around the room, wild with terror, pleading for help. Then I realized that it was more than death that scared her. She suddenly realized she couldn't speak and would never get to say those things we would all want to say to the people closest to us if death was imminent. We always think there will be more time, but for her, time had run out, still in possession of her faculties but completely unable to communicate the most important message in the world. So I leaned in close and said the most comforting thing I could think of. "I know you love me, Mom. I know you love me. I know. Now I'm crying at work. Time for a break. Call your mom." Reddit. We saw an accident on I-35 near Georgetown, TX, north of Austin. It happened a few cars ahead of us. Traffic stopped and a tractor-trailer was unable to stop and rear-ended a small maroon compact car, absolutely crushing it into the back of another trailer. We were one of the first 10 cars to pass the accident. There was really no car left in front of the dash or behind the front seats, just twisted metal that looked like a crushed can. I remember the look of horror on the face of the lady in the passenger seat as passed them. If that wasn't already bad enough, that evening we found out their daughter was somewhere in that back seat. A friend and I were walking to the swimming pool for rookie lifeguard lessons. We were 14 at the time, and walked through the car park area to get to the front door of the pool center. We saw an ambulance crew surrounding what appeared to be a homeless man squatting with his trousers around his ankles. As we stopped for a second, morbid curiosity and all that, to see what was going on, the homeless man let out a pained scream and started pooing out what turned out to be his own rectum. Needless to say, it had a bit of an effect on me for quite some time whenever it came to using the loo. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.